Hello guys, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Здравствуйте, мои друзья. Today I'm going to talk about the struggle for power and the rise of Joseph Stalin and the hit in the story of Joseph Stalin. So I think I covered almost all the leaders of the Soviet Union, starting from Khrushchev, Brezhnev, Andropov, Chernenko, and Gorbachev and Lenin. But the only leader I missed covering was Joseph Stalin. So, so Joseph Stalin was the leader. Was the leader of the former Soviet Union from 1924 to 1953, who was the dictator of the USSR. So, Stalin was born on December 18th, 1878 or 1879 in Gori, Georgia, which was a part of the Russian Empire, which would later be a part of the former Soviet Union. So he was born in Gori, Georgia. So he was born to he wasn't a Russian, Stalin. He was a Georgian. Georgia is a small country located in between Armenia and Georgia and Russia. Not the Georgia in the United States I'm talking about. So his mom was very religious. So he wanted Stalin to become a priest. He wanted his son to become a priest in Georgia. He wanted to become a priest, so he wanted to send him to a church. But I don't think his father was religious. But Stalin's real name before he became Stalin was Joseph Zhugashvili, which was a Georgian name, like I mentioned in the previous video of Lenin. So he was Zhugashvili, and while he was in school, he was reading the writings of Karl Marx, the German philosopher who was also known as the father of communism today. So those books were outlawed; they were against the law to read, and he was expelled from the church, from school. So he became very interested in Karl Marx, who was the philosopher in Germany, and Stalin began to take part in these robberies in Georgia. He became friends with Vladimir Lenin during that time in the 1900s, and he also took part in the 1907 Tbilisi robbery in the Russian Empire. So he was arrested in 1907, I believe. So Joseph Stalin's nickname was Kuba. Or when he was a child, his nickname was Soso. When he was a kid, Stalin's nickname when he was a kid. So after the Bolsheviks returned to Russia in 1917, when the Germans gave them money to return to Russia, Stalin became the new editor of the newspaper Pravda, which was a newspaper in the former Soviet Union. And I think it's still used in Russia today, I believe. So during Russian Revolution, he took part in the Russian Civil War, which was a civil war fought between the Bolsheviks, or the Red Army, and between the White Army, which was anti-communist during that time. So after the revolutions in 1917, the Soviet Union won, the communists won, the Bolsheviks won the war, the Russian Civil War against the White Army, and Soviet Union was established. It was created on December 30th, 1922. So, following the death of Comrade Lenin on January 21st, 1924, there was a struggle for power for who was going to be the new leader of Soviet Union. It was between Leon Trotsky and Joseph Stalin. Trotsky was the friend of no, not Joseph Stalin. He was the friend of Lenin. Trotsky was against Stalin though, because he really didn't like Stalin during his time. So Stalin became the new leader of Soviet Union, or the new general secretary of the Communist Party of the USSR, following Lenin's death. And he sent Trotsky into exile to Kazakhstan. And on February 29th, in February 1929. But then he was forced to leave the Soviet Union, and he went to go to Mexico. That's where he was in exile during that time. So people in Soviet Union were quite scared of Stalin, because he started like killing people over millions of his own people. By the 1930s, there was the Great Purges, which killed millions of Soviet people in Soviet Union from 1936 to 1939, when it all ended. So top government officials in Soviet Union were killed, and top generals or top commanders of Joseph Stalin were killed, and generals of Stalin were killed during the 30s. And by 1933, a major famine struck the Soviet Ukraine, or the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, by 1933, and a lot of people were killed in the Soviet Ukraine. And by 1924, Stalin became the absolute ruler of the Soviet Union when he won power over Trotsky, who was one of the members of the Bolshevik Party during that time. So Stalin took power following that, and he killed most of his generals. He killed Trotsky in exile because he sent some KGB guys to kill him. He killed Nikolai Bakharin and some other generals I don't remember. During that time, a lot of generals were killed. He killed Bakharin because Bakharin was against him, and he killed this other government officials in Soviet Union that were against him, or he even sent them to gulags. Gulags were these labor camps in the former Soviet Union. If you were against Stalin, millions of people were killed in gulags if they refused to work in the gulag camps. So Stalin was quite scary for Soviet Union, because he was scary because he killed a lot of even innocent people. And I remember there was a story that my grandma told me that when when people were sleeping in their houses or in their beds, Stalin would open the door and get a knife and just stab them to death. Would just kill them. Would kill everybody. Would kill anyone who's against them while his enemies were asleep. So by 1939, the year when World War II began, before that, in 1936, there was the Spanish Civil War that was fought against the nationalists and the fascists, I believe. The fascists were the Spanish, the Nazi Germany, and fascist Italy. And the nationalists, between the nationalists and Republicans. The Republicans were the Soviet Union, and the nationalists were Nazi Germany. The Spanish Civil War was fought for 3 years under Franco, who was the Spanish general or dictator of Spain during that time. So by 1939, World War II was about to begin, but before the war started, in 1939, on August 23rd, 1939, Soviet Union and Nazi Germany signed a pact to be allies, which was known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which was an alliance between the Soviet Union and the United States to which was an alliance between the Soviet Union and the United States. So during his rule, World War II began in 1930 on September 1st, 1939, when Nazi Germany invaded Poland, and then days later, on September 17th, 1939, under the leadership of Joseph Stalin, the Soviet Union invaded Poland on September 17th, 1939, and they both occupied borders of Poland. But 2 years later, Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June 22nd, 1941. And that kind of shocked Stalin a bit, because Stalin thought they were allies with the Soviet Union. Because he thought Nazi Germany was allies with Soviet Union, or Hitler's Germany. So Stalin was kind of shocked, and he didn't speak. No one seen him on the radio. No one heard from him on the radio, because he was shocked. And then days later, on July 15th, 1941, Joseph Stalin gave a speech against Nazi Germany and saying, "We will fight the Germans. We will fight them." And that's what happened. The war, and that became known as the Great Patriotic War, which was a war fought between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union from 1941 to 1945, when Nazi Germany capitulated, when the Nazi Germany dissolved. So that's what happened during the rule of Stalin. So, when Nazi Germany was going to Moscow, which was the capital of Soviet Union, going to the Soviet Union, the Germans started going to Moscow, and there was a battle in Moscow. So the Soviet Union started going to Siberia so they could create their own weapons, so they could build their own factories, and build their own weapons and tanks and cannons to fight against the German fascists on the Eastern Front. And one of Stalin's famous generals, Marshal Zhukov, Georgy Zhukov, was one of the generals of Soviet Union who fought against the Germans. And he was quite a fascinating general, because he beated the Germans in battle without dying. So when Soviet Union went back to Moscow to fight the Germans, there was a very cold winter. So Germans were froze to death because it was snowing and it was very cold, and it prevented them further from going into the Soviet Union. So Soviet Union started pushing back the Germans from Moscow. By 1941, 1942, they started pushing back the Germans, or the Nazis, from Moscow, the capital of the former Soviet Union. So that's what happened during his rule. And by 1943, we had another offense. No, 1942, that was when the Nazis invaded Leningrad, which is now Volgograd today. So there was a huge battle in Leningrad during that time, because there was the German laid siege to the city, and millions of people died in the Battle of Leningrad. One of the generals in Leningrad were Georgy Zhukov and Nikita Khrushchev. But Khrushchev wasn't famous during that time, because he was just a general. That was before he became General Secretary of the Communist Party of the USSR. So millions of people died in Stalingrad, and people had to eat rats in Stalingrad because there was no food in Stalingrad. And that was kind of like terrible. So by February 2nd, 1943, the Battle of Stalingrad was over because the Soviets defeated the Nazis in battle. And there was also a siege of Leningrad. During that time, Leningrad was the city in Soviet Union. And Germans also started attacking the city. That battle lasted for over 800 days. From 1941 to 1944, for 3 years. So that battle was kind of devastating because a lot of people were killed, the same amount of people killed in Stalingrad during that time. And by 1944, 1943, when we really started winning the war, we started kicking the Nazis' asses in Eastern Europe. We started liberating the countries that were under the Nazi occupation under Hitler. And by April 1945, the Soviets pushed the Nazis all the way to Berlin, which led to the Battle of Berlin, the final battle of the European front, in which Hitler killed himself with his wife. And that led to the end of World War II in Europe. And Soviet people were very happy about that the war was over in Europe. And Stalin went on the radio and he gave an announcement that the Great Patriotic War has came to an end. And the war with Nazi Germany was over and all Nazi Germany surrendered. So following the end of World War II, the United States and Soviet Union were allies during most of the war from 1939 to 1945. Soviet Union and the United States were very good friends during the war. But after World War II, with the use of the atomic bomb, after the use of the United States dropping the nuclear bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Soviet Union knew about the bomb already. They learned about the atomic bomb when Stalin, the chairman of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, met with Winston Churchill, who was the Prime Minister of Britain, of the United Kingdom, and he met with Harry Truman, who was the President of the United States. And they started talking about the atomic bomb, and Stalin said, we know about the atomic bomb already. So the United States dropped two atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which were two Japanese cities. On the first bomb they dropped on Hiroshima was on April 6, 1945, and the second bomb, known as Fat Man or Fat Boy, was dropped on Nagasaki on August 9th, 1945. So and then after the war, after they dropped the two atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the war with Japan was over. The war in the Pacific was over. It came to an end. So after World War II, we had the Marshall Project in the United States, which was to recover Europe and rebuild Europe from the devastation the destruction that Germany caused during World War II. And actually the Eastern countries like Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Hungary, and East Germany, they fell under communism because they were liberated by the Soviet Union. And that started the Iron Curtain. And that started the Cold War. While Western Europe fell under the rule of capitalism, in which everything is owned privately by private individuals. And communism is basically when everything is owned by everybody. That's how communism and capitalism works. So even after the war, the Soviet Union and the United States became enemies. But they were friends during during the World War II because they helped fight against the Germans. But then in 1948 was when the Cold War started, and Soviet Union and United States became arch enemies. They were allies during World War II, but then they became arch enemies, and then they started spying on each other on nuclear weapons and stuff. So And during Stalin's rule in the 1950s, he in the 1950s the Korean War started, which was a war thought between the North Korea and South Korea. South Korea fell under the rule of the United States, which was capitalism, and North Korea fell under the rule of communism, which was under the Soviet Union. So, if you remember, by 1938, the Soviet Union started. They left North Korea, Soviet Union, and in 1939-49, North Korea, United Americans started leaving South Korea. But before Soviet Union and United States occupied the Korean Peninsula, it was under the rule of Japan. And China also became communism after the World War II under the new leadership of Mao Zedong, who was allies with Joseph Stalin. So by 1953, he died on March 5th, 1953. He died at the age of 70. What was it? The age of 74. Joseph Stalin died at the age of 74 during that time. He died, and there was actually a funeral held for Joseph Stalin in Moscow following his death. And there was a struggle for power after the death of Stalin. So he was succeeded by Nikita Khrushchev as the first secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, while Yuri Malenkov was elected the prime minister or the premier of the former Soviet Union. So that was the story of Joseph Stalin. And my father's father, or my grandfather, was born during the Stalin time with my grandma, was also born during the Stalin time. So those were the scary times of Joseph Stalin's rule. And I'm going to talk about more of my family's life in Soviet Union and more history on Soviet Union in the next video. And I'll see you guys there. Bye bye.